Thank you.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, I accept. So today's topics, going back to GraphQL right here, just for the people watching the recording, talked about some different technologies that GraphQL came up in as I was learning them. And the topics today are going to be what is GraphQL, what is like the anatomy of GraphQL or the technical terms that you need to know to work in GraphQL, who uses it, why do they use it, and then how might you use it. So let's start with who uses GraphQL. So on the right, there are a few companies that not only use GraphQL, but specifically use Apollo with GraphQL, which is why there's a little spaceman in the corner down there. But GraphQL was originally invented at Facebook, now Meta. It was used internally starting in 2012, and then they open sourced it in 2015. And it came from a need for efficient data loading, because as they started seeing more mobile usage, they realized that GraphQL was a necessary technology to kind of accommodate the limitations that come with mobile and how much data you can hold at a time. So it's since been adopted by a lot of companies. Some of the most well-known ones would be Shopify, Instagram, Twitter, and GitHub, but there are a ton more companies that use GraphQL out there. So what is GraphQL? It's a query language for your API. That's the simplest definition. And it kind of makes sense that it's called GraphQL, QL being for query language. So we'll see what that means as we dive into the different parts of the GraphQL system. So the schema is the heart of GraphQL. It's kind of like a contract. It describes what data will be available in your API, what fields will be available on these different types that you see in your schema. Some call outs here from the picture on the right. This is just a snippet of a GraphQL schema. At the top, there's a couple of scalars. So there are some default scalars that you get with GraphQL that include int, float, string, boolean, and then ID, like this capital ID that we see here at the top of the contact type. But there are other scalars that are custom that you can bring into your schema. And so a couple of those are the scalars on lines 1 and 2 there. So that is a little snippet of what the schema looks like. You've got types. Input is something that you would use as an argument, and we'll see kind of what arguments look like in just a second. So there's a couple of little signs that you might see when you're looking at a GraphQL schema. Not pictured here though is like a hashtag or a pound sign that you would use to add comments. And actually, it's a good idea to add comments, which I did not do in my example, but you would see that whenever you load up a schema, it would have your commented information about what each field means or represents. But a couple of the symbols I wanted to call out here are the @ sign, which is a directive. There are several different directives that you have, but the one that I'm using in this example is deprecated. And that would indicate a field that you don't really want people to continue using, but it's still available. So part of the benefits of GraphQL, or one of them, is evolvability is something that they say. So you're able to deprecate fields without breaking things or while remaining backwards compatible. And so that's kind of one of the directives that enables that capability. And then the exclamation point indicates a required field or a non-nullable field. So in this snippet, we have a type that is a contact. and there are 3 required fields on it that I will always expect to get back when I'm querying for contacts: ID, first name, and last name. But the other ones that don't have exclamation points could be null. So I just mentioned querying. There are actually special types in a GraphQL schema that are query and mutation. And this is where I'm starting to use some terminology that comes from REST, because I figured that some people on this call might have a REST background or familiarity with how REST APIs work. Queries are basically the equivalent of a GET call in a REST API. So you're fetching data with your queries. Here I can get a contact, and if I pass the argument of the ID, I'm going to get just the contact information that is associated with that ID. And then in get contacts, I'm going to get back an array of contacts. So that's what the contact in the square brackets indicates. On the mutation side, that describes what you would call in REST a delete, put, or patch. Patch, also sometimes referred to as update. So that is how we modify data through a GraphQL schema. And I have some examples in my mutation type of some of the typical operations that you might see listed in mutations. So creating a contact, using the contact input that we saw on the last or a couple of slides ago. This contact input would be what comprises the argument that you're passing into this mutation here to create a contact. You would update a contact by passing an ID for that contact and then the information that you want to update on that contact. And similar with delete and delete contacts, you can pass in, well, actually delete contacts would delete everyone, not specific contacts, because we don't have an argument there. On the right side of this colon, if that's not already clear, that is what you would get returned back to you after executing a mutation or a query. So if I run get contact, I'm going to receive information on a contact that matches the type that I defined up here. So I would expect to get back an object. Again, maybe with some null values for the non-required fields, but always with the required fields included. So those are queries and mutations. A couple of other terms that are good to know, I might have mentioned these already, are fields and arguments. So a field is a unit of data that you've requested. This is from a different schema that is not in my example. I just grabbed this, I think, from Apollo documentation. But the fields here are human, name, and height. And then the arguments are not always available, but in this case, I could query just a human with a specific ID, and I could request a height with a specific unit. So an argument's always going to come in a key value pair, and it's always going to be attached to a field if it's available. We're gonna get into doing some dynamic querying in just a bit, but here's kind of like a little diagram of what that looks like when you actually execute a query. It usually has, you have to define the type. You would either see query or mutation here. The operation name, I think, is actually optional, but I think it's typical to include a name that is title cased like this. If you're passing variables, then you can define them like this. And what makes it dynamic is that you're using this $sign. So you're creating a variable definition here, and then you're passing it in to the hero field there. And then what you would get back is in this section right here. Can everyone see like where my cursor is? Or okay, good. Just making sure that's visible. So in these curly brackets are what is called a selection set. So that would be whatever fields you want to get back from this query. Down here is the variable set that you're passing in. So Jedi would be piped in right here where you have the episode argument being passed in. So that's pretty much it for the anatomy. That's all I'm going to talk about today. There are a ton of other things we could talk about with GraphQL, like subscriptions are another special type like query and mutation. But I feel like if you're just getting started with GraphQL, these are kind of the basic puzzle pieces that you need to get going. So let's talk a little bit about why you would use GraphQL. 3 words that I would use to describe GraphQL, and not just me, but I've encountered these words in a lot of articles about GraphQL, is that it is predictable, it is discoverable, and it is efficient. So because you have this schema where you're defining all the types and you're defining the fields that you can expect on those types, that makes it pretty predictable. You have this contract that you can refer to, and it makes it predictable what kind of data you need to pass in and what kind of data you can expect to come out. Your client also knows what fields are available. And so, you know, when you're working with a REST API, it's a little obscured, we'll say, like I'm going to hit an endpoint, but I don't always know exactly what I'm going to get back. And sometimes I don't know how to construct that endpoint. So we're going to talk a little bit about endpoints in here as well. Actually, I should call that out now probably. A GraphQL API uses a single endpoint, whereas REST will use more than one endpoint normally. So we'll see a little diagram of that in a second. What makes GraphQL discoverable is partly that you've got one endpoint to deal with, so you don't have to have like your API documented somewhere so that you know what endpoints are available. I think that's one reason why it's easy to use GraphQL and discover how to use it or how to interact with it. And then it's also efficient, and we'll kind of use the diagram to illustrate how it's efficient. Sorry, got a little dry in my throat there. So let's go to this bullet point here. So going back to endpoints, GraphQL queries are organized in terms of types and fields, not endpoints. So if we look back at the example of the schema, in REST, I might expect if I want information on a contact that my endpoint is going to have to include contact in it, but not in GraphQL. In GraphQL, it's going to be organized by the type that I define in my request. And so that's one way that it is organized by types and fields rather than endpoints. So that's a key difference between GraphQL and REST to keep in mind. Another, well, actually, this is on the topic of efficiency specifically. Why do people say that GraphQL is more efficient than REST? Well, what you would normally need 2 or more requests to accomplish with REST can actually be done in one call with GraphQL. So let's see if I can, actually I have an example on the next, a couple slides later. So this is a pretty cool public API, or a picture from a publicly available GraphQL API that was built on top of Spotify's REST API. So you can use the REST API that Spotify created, or if you want to use GraphQL instead, there's a cool version that I have pictured here. So to illustrate how you would need more than one request with REST versus GraphQL, this entire piece on the left-hand side here is a single request. and I'm getting back information on a specific track. I'm also getting information back on the artists that are associated with that track. And I'm doing a query on a specific artist down here. So some of the terms that we learned that are coming back around here are like the arguments that I'm passing in as the name of the artist and the name of the track, the fields that I'm requesting back in the selection set for artists, or the parent selection set on the track. And I've boxed the three things that I think would normally translate into one REST request each. So if I were using REST, I would need to hit an endpoint to get track information. Then I would need to hit another endpoint to get the artist information for that track or what's returned by that track. And then I would need to hit another endpoint to get my artist information for my specific artist, Saba. But in this case, I can make one request and then I get all of that data back like you see on the right here. So pretty efficient. I don't have to do a lot of like async awaiting for one REST request to resolve before I make another one. And so I think that's one reason why I've really enjoyed using GraphQL is it's very developer friendly, and this is one of the reasons why I find it to be so. Backtracking here just to drive home that point, this is a separate schema example or a different GraphQL API than the ones we've looked at, but let's say you had a schema where you wanted to request posts and comments and authors for like a message board, it kind of looks like. I could do that with one single GraphQL request over here on the right, but if I were using a REST API, I would need 3 separate ones. So there's a little bit of comparison between GraphQL and REST. And now let's talk about how you can actually use a GraphQL API. What are the different ways that you can hit it? So you could use a GraphQL IDE or integrated development environment. And one good example is Apollo Explorer, which we will definitely look at today. You can also do a curl request, which I have a little picture of what that might look like if you were using curl to interact with GraphQL. Side note, all GraphQL queries or all GraphQL requests are going to be labeled post. So that is another difference with REST. You might have to like switch between your get and your post and your delete as your operators that your HTTP verbs, but all of them are going to say post whenever you're working with a GraphQL API. You can also use fetch, which I have an example of below here. Fetch is a pretty standard way, at least in JavaScript, to fetch information from an endpoint. So that could be a REST API or it could be a GraphQL API. And then the fourth way would be using a client. So there are a lot of GraphQL clients out there. The Apollo client is one really great one that is able to interact with a variety of applications and using a variety of languages. So we are going to at least play around with the Explorer today. I might show a little bit of my code using an Apollo client if time allows. So I felt like this would be an opportune time to apply our learning. If anybody wants to get hands-on using a GraphQL API, I have a little QR code here. But also, I'm going to just open this up and maybe I can post a link in the chat for people to use. Cool. let me post this in the chat, but I'll give people a second if they want to use the QR code to get set up. Oh, I just saw someone loved my walk-up song. Thank you. Appreciate that. Nobody ever knows that song when I bring it up. And I have not seen Bad Boys for Life, just in case you were wondering. It's like one of the main songs from that movie. So if you use the QR code, or if you went to the link that I just posted in the chat, it connects you to a public API by Trevor Blades called Countries. I'm not sure what the protocol is with Women Who Code, if there's a way to share out these slides, but I did include some links to some other public APIs that are fun to play with, including the one that I pictured here that is the GraphQL version of the Spotify API. There's a Star Wars one, there's a Pokemon one, so there's really something for everyone, and I chose possibly the most boring one to use for today's example, but so here's a playground. Hopefully you guys are in it and are gonna play around a little bit with me. So if I start typing out, well, let me actually show something over here. If you expand the docs over here, this is part of one of the things that makes GraphQL very discoverable, is that it can take what you define in your schema and it can show it to you so that you know what fields and what types are available through your schema. So I can see here, this is a list of queries that I can run. So let's see, what if I want to get a country? Or actually, let's just get maybe all the countries if we can. Countries. If I start typing over here, oh, I need to actually define it as a query first. I need to give it a name, or I might not have to, but I'm going to. And then open up my curly braces, and now I should be able to start querying. And I hope you can see the little like windows that are popping up here that are giving me some autocomplete help. Super helpful. If I type countries and I open up another set of curly braces, I could start asking for specific fields back on a country. So in my country type, I can see I have some fields that are definitely going to be there because I see the exclamation point and they must be required. So let's do code. Let's do name and phone. I didn't know you could call a country. That's interesting. I'm assuming that's what that means. And then if I hit the play button over here, I see that I have gotten a list of countries. So I knew I could expect that, right? Part of the predictability of this schema or this contract is that I know when I run this query that I'm going to get a list of countries based on the country type in the square brackets over here. So I've got a lot of countries to choose. This returns, I guess, every single country, or I could add some filtering, it looks like, with the country filter input. I'm not going to try to do that because I think that might be a little too complicated for this example, but let's query back just one country because I see here that I can just get specific information about a country based on the code. So I'm going to change this, or actually I'm going to comment it out. If I do command /, it comments things out, and then you can see, like we mentioned earlier, the # is how you know that that's commented out code. So let's start querying just one country. Or actually, you know what? Well, I'll try it this way. So I'm going to pass an argument of a code. And let's give the ID, what's a good country? I think I heard, well, let's do Belgium. So if I pass it the specific country code BE, I'm going to open up my curly braces there. And then I should be able to get all the same information back that I could when I was querying all the countries, but this time just for a single one. So this time let's do the capital and an emoji. I like emojis. Actually, let's get the name too. Might be useful. So you can see here that I'm only querying back the things that I care about. And that's one of the powerful things about GraphQL that I think I mentioned earlier is the client really decides what information it wants to get back. And it's not going to overfetch a bunch of information that it doesn't need. So that's kind of one of the advantages of it over REST is that with REST, you typically would be overfetching unless you worked really closely with the API guy to make sure that you had a request that only got you the things that you wanted to power your front end. So cool, I just executed the country query and I got back the information about Belgium, capital Brussels, and there's a little flag emoji, pretty cool. If I comment this back in, I can, again, in a single request, get back all the things. So just to reiterate what we were talking about earlier, I would have had to make 2 separate requests with REST to accomplish this, but instead I'm doing it with one. So hopefully you got your hands dirty a little bit with this GraphQL API example. I'm going to switch over to Apollo Studio because there's a feature in Apollo Studio, which we mentioned here is one of the ways that you can interact with the GraphQL API is using an IDE like Apollo Explorer. Apollo Studio is where you can use the Explorer. So I'm going to go here. Oh, cool. Let's see, do I have a GitHub sign in? This is why I didn't start with this example. Oh, cool, Big Papa, awesome. Seeing all my secrets over here. Let's go into that. So in the Apollo Studio, I can go to execute some queries and I can set my endpoint to be whatever I want it to be. So in this case, I'm going to set it to be the same GraphQL API that we were just using in the playground that Trevor Blades deployed. But I'm going to test it out in here just to show you a little bit of the difference. So let's go back here. This seems like it's not working like I expected. Really want to show you guys what click and build queries look like if I can get into the right part of Explorer over here. Well, that is not behaving as expected. Sorry, guys. But maybe we can do a different way to show click and build queries. Oh, I'm in like Federation mode over here, it looks like. Okay. So actually, let's just do GraphQL Explorer. Have a backup plan here. actually called graphical. So graphical with the I in the middle of the GraphQL this is the original way that I was testing out GraphQL APIs, was using this little graphical app that was deployed by Hasura. Okay, here we go. So on the left, I've now got an Explorer that was not available to me in this playground that Trevor Blades came up with. And what's cool about this Explorer is that it will let me click and build queries. So you can see it already is starting to fill in parts of the query for me instead of my typing it out. And it's still going to give me, I think, some autocomplete functionality like we saw in the other environment. But I don't have to type out the fields myself. I can just click and it's going to add all the fields that I want. I can pass it a code. Let's see, let's not do continent, or actually, yeah, let's first look at all the continents here. Comment this out and we'll pick one. Okay. So I have continents and I really want to get a code so that I can ask for a specific continent. Okay, so like Antarctica has a code of AN. So if I wanted to just request information on Antarctica, I would put in AN as my code here. And then voila, it looks like they don't have capital or currency coming back. Those must not be required fields. I could check that out in the docs over here like we did in the other playground. So yeah, I'm gonna post this in the chat too, because I think this is a really cool tool to use as well if you're playing around with graphical. Yeah, it is a sweet tool. Thanks guys, I'm glad you like it. And that is an I in the URL, graphical. Yes, little fun play on words there. Okay, cool. What else should we talk about? Well, you know what? Now's a good time to do a little check for understanding. I've got a quiz. So I'll let you join my Slido and I'll set that up on another screen. Quiz time. You can take the teacher out of the classroom, but you can't take the classroom out of the teacher, something like that. How is Erica the most awesome? That's a really good question. Okay, cool. How many people, I wish I could see how many people have joined. I don't want to cut anyone short here, but join the quiz. Okay, let's get started. I think they're timed, so everybody's got to be on their toes. Oh wait, sorry. Let me let people join. I didn't go to the right screen in time. Pancake. Good luck, Pancake. Best of luck to you. All right, I see there's 23 people on the call and 13 people in the Slido. I'm not going to force participation, but I do want to allow a little bit of time.
I like this interactive bit, Erica. I just wanted to give that feedback while we were waiting.
Thanks, Sandy. I was real bummed that my Kahoot limits prevented me from using that because I do love a Kahoot. They have good GIF or GIF integration, which Slido could definitely use. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Start the quiz. All right. What does the QL in GraphQL stand for? All right. Yes, people were paying attention. Love to see it. That is the correct answer. Next question. Which of the following companies invented GraphQL? It's kind of a trick question because they all use it, but only one invented it. And most of you got it right. It is, or at the time it was Facebook and now known as Meta. All right, which of the following is not a default scalar type for GraphQL? Should have played some Ritmo in the background. Sorry guys, I wasn't prepared with music. All right, so this was kind of tricky. I didn't have it visually on the slide, a list of the default scalar types, but if you remember in my little schema clip here, you have to define the custom scalar types at the top, and one of them was date. So that is not included as a default scalar type. So good job to those of you that remember date is not default. Which of the following symbols indicates a required field in GraphQL? Is it hashtag, $, @, or exclamation point? All right, it is exclamation point. So I think all of these signs made an appearance. Hashtag is how you comment out code in a schema. $ is how you pass dynamic query variables. The @ is how you add a directive, like the deprecated directive that we talked about. And exclamation point is how you indicate a non-nullable or required field. Next question. Which REST verbs correspond with GraphQL mutations? So this is a multi-select. If I did it right, it's a multi-select. We'll see what happens. Yeah, okay, cool. So there's queries and mutations, which we talked about. Queries correspond with get or fetching data, and then put, patch, and delete are all changing data. So those are mutation verbs. All right, next question. In what way is a GraphQL API discoverable? The schema is self-documenting. There is multiple endpoints, are multiple endpoints to discover. There are a lot of GraphQL APIs out there waiting to be discovered. Is it discoverable? I like that people were asking. It is discoverable. And part of this was kind of a tricky one. The schema being self-documenting is how you're able to see what types are available and what fields are available on those types. And so that is one way that you can discover how to use or interact with the API. All right, a GraphQL API returns data in JSON format. Shoot, we didn't talk about this, guys. Sorry, I didn't teach you very well, but you did see some data returned. So did it look like JSON to you? It looked like JSON to 94% of you, and you were correct. Let's look at that real quick again. So over here where we were querying the countries API, this is an object with, it's a JSON JavaScript object notation. It has the form of JSON here with the data that's returned from your query. So yes, JSON is the love language of GraphQL. Which of the following is an advantage of GraphQL over REST? So GraphQL fetches only the data requested, GraphQL overfetches data, GraphQL has a multitude of endpoints, or GraphQL can make more calls than REST. Wow, you guys did great on that question. Yes, it is an advantage that GraphQL only fetches the data you requested. So over here, I only care about, emojis mainly. So I'm only going to get back the data that I care about. And in that way, I'm not overfetching a bunch of fields that I don't really need. So that is an advantage. Which of the following is an advantage of GraphQL? Predictable, discoverable, expansive, or efficient? This is multi-select, by the way. Awesome. Yeah, y'all. Well, it's discoverable and efficient. That is true. It is also predictable because it behaves in ways that we expect based on what we know from the schema and the contract that we get out of the schema. So those are the keywords to keep in mind when you're talking about GraphQL and why people want to use it. Last question. The Apollo Explorer is an example of an IDE for interacting with the GraphQL API. Is this true or false? All right. It is true. And I really wanted to show you the Apollo Explorer today, but you got a pretty good taste of what features you would expect from using the Apollo Explorer that we saw in the, I closed it already, but the graphical interface that we saw in the Hasura playground has the click and build queries. It has the documentation that's visible there, and that is also available in the Apollo Explorer as well. Yes, astronaut cats are cool. And let's see what the results. Oh no, I didn't show I saw Megan Jane's one briefly before I somehow tabbed out of there, but sorry, y'all. Y'all did a great job. Megan Jane's did the best job, but that's no surprise. She's amazing. And she's going to teach you all about cockroach at the next session. Yeah, I promised that I would show a Zodiac Contacts app today, and then I had a bunch of technical difficulties before we got started that my database was not accessible anymore. So I apologize for not bringing that, but I am gonna probably push up that code. And if you ever wanna see a kind of a front to back example or back end to front end example of how to use GraphQL in a real stack, I can definitely share that out. Maybe that could be another session once I get my Mongo situation fixed. But yeah, let's just talk about some takeaways, and then we can wrap up here. So we learned some key terms today: schema, fields, queries, mutations, arguments, type system, scalar, directives. You know what all these things mean now. Some of the key ideas are that GraphQL operates over HTTP using a single endpoint as opposed to multiple endpoints with REST. Responses are in JSON format. It uses declarative data fetching, which is essentially declaring what fields you want so that you don't get a bunch of fields that you don't need. The IDEs like Apollo Explorer are really useful for helping you understand or explore your schema. And then sometimes it can even help you build queries with a click or some autocomplete feature, which is nice. And some of the advantages are that it's developer friendly, it's self-documenting, there's no overfetching, it supports multiple languages and frameworks, and it is evolvable. So one last call out is that there's a little GraphQL summit. It's not little, they do it every year, it's pretty big. But it's coming up in October, and if you don't get a ticket to go to the summit, they're usually good about hosting the talks, and you can see talks from previous years as well. I've learned a lot by watching talks from GraphQL summits, and I think they're really interesting, and they go into specific use cases that maybe would apply to your projects or what you're doing at work. So I recommend checking those out. And I don't have a slide about it, but I'm going to plug that my team is looking for some database expertise, and we love hiring women and people from diverse backgrounds on our team. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, please reach out. Love to talk to you, love to connect with you, and thanks for watching my GraphQL talk.
That was so great, Erica. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any questions for her as we wrap things up? I want to give a little bit of space if anybody just has anything they want to clarify or ask her. Like, you could just drop it in the chat, unmute, whatever works best for you. Oh, I see people are asking about your slides, Erica. So as long as you're cool with it, we will share the slides out. We will.
I would love.
Okay, good.
I would love to share them. Good. I'm glad there's interest. I'm glad that I was worried they were not very accessible with my color scheme. So I'm glad that didn't interfere with people enjoying them.
Yep. We'll get a copy of them. And probably the easiest way is to put them in the meetup, drop them in the meetup link here, and then everybody can access them. We did record. We can probably stop recording if we didn't do that already. We